There were 3 plants growing beside my grandmother's front door the morning she died. I know this because I was the one who found her, sitting in the chair she always sat in, still upright, still facing the garden, her hands folded in her lap, like she had simply decided to stop. She was 91 years old. She had never been to a hospital. She had never swallowed a pill that came from a factory. And when we washed her body and dressed her for burial, her skin was clear, her joints were straight, her eyes had closed as peacefully as a child falling asleep after a long day of work. I stood in that doorway for a long time before I went inside to tell anyone. I looked at those 3 plants. Plantain, growing flat against the stone, elderberry, rising tall against the porch rail, and chamomile, scattered like tiny white stars along the edge of the walkway. They had been there my entire life. They had been there before my life. My grandmother had not planted them because they were pretty. She had planted them because they were necessary. I want to tell you about those 3 plants. But more than that, I want to tell you what my grandmother understood about healing that the modern world has almost completely forgotten. And I want to tell you about the day, many years after her death, when I watched a man from outside our community nearly lose his daughter to something one of those doorstep plants could have resolved in 20 minutes. That story I will get to, but it changed me. It changed the way I understood what we carry as a people and what the world threw away without even knowing it had something worth keeping. Let me begin where every true lesson begins, with the soil. My grandmother was not what you would call a healer. She would have frowned at that word. She was a woman who paid attention. That is what she called it, paying attention. She paid attention to the weather, to the animals, to the way a child's breathing changed in the night, to the color of a person's tongue when they said they felt fine, but something was wrong. She did not read books about plants. She did not need to. Her mother had taught her, and her mother's mother before that, going back so far that nobody remembered who was first. The knowledge was not written down. It lived in hands. When I was 5 years old, I stepped on a wasp nest near the barn. I remember the sound before the pain, that low, angry hum that fills the air like heat. I was stung 11 times on my feet and ankles. I ran to the house screaming, and my grandmother was already outside before I reached the porch. She did not panic. She did not even speak right away. She bent down, pulled 3 leaves of plantain from the ground beside the door, the same ground I had run across, chewed them briefly in her mouth, and pressed the wet green paste against the worst of the stings. Within minutes the fire went out of my skin. Within an hour I had forgotten it happened. That was my first lesson about plantain, though I did not know it had a name. To me, it was simply the plant my grandmother reached for when something went wrong with the skin. A sting, a cut, a burn from the stove, a rash from wandering too far into the wrong patch of woods. Plantain was always the first answer. Now let me tell you what this plant actually is, because I think most people outside our community walk past it every single day without knowing what grows beneath their feet. Plantain, not the banana, the leaf, is one of the most common plants in the world. It grows in cracks in the road. It grows at the edge of driveways and between fence posts and in every yard that has not been poisoned into silence by chemicals. It is low to the ground, with broad-ribbed leaves that feel thick between your fingers, almost rubbery. It is not beautiful. Nobody puts it in a vase. And that may be why the world forgot what it can do. My grandmother used plantain for everything that happened on the surface of the body. Every cut, every insect sting, every blister, every splinter that had gone deep and needed drawing out. She would crush the leaf, sometimes chew it, sometimes pound it with a stone, and lay it directly on the wound. She called it the pulling leaf because she said it pulled what was bad out of the body through the skin. I watched her draw infection from a wound on my uncle's hand that had swollen so badly he could not close his fingers. 2 days of plantain poultice, changed every few hours, and the swelling broke, and the redness drained, and he was back to work on the third morning. Do you know what would have happened if he had gone to a hospital? I do not say this to be unkind. I say it because I have seen it. They would have given him pills that upset his stomach. They might have cut the wound open to drain it. They would have charged him money he did not have. And the healing would have taken the same amount of time, or longer. I have watched this happen. I have watched people from the towns near us spend weeks recovering from things that our grandmothers resolved in days, because the old knowledge was right there in the ground, and nobody bent down to pick it up. Every Amish home I've ever entered, every one, has plantain growing within arm's reach of the front door. This is not by accident. It is by design. My grandmother planted it there the way you might keep a fire extinguisher near the stove. It was the first medicine, the one you reached for before you even had to think. Now let me tell you about the second plant, the elder tree. Elderberry grew against my grandmother's porch rail, and it grew against my mother's porch rail, and it grows against mine. It has been growing in the same place in our community for longer than anyone can trace. The elder tree is taller than a man, with clusters of tiny white flowers in the spring and dark purple berries by late summer. Both the flowers and the berries are used, but in different seasons and for different purposes. And this is where the knowledge becomes something you cannot learn from a label on a bottle. My grandmother picked the flowers in early summer, when they were fully open and smelled like sweet honey left in the sun. She dried them on cloth in the shade, never in the sun, she was particular about that, and stored them in linen bags hung from the ceiling beams. When someone in the house began to feel the first signs of a cold or a chest illness, the scratchy throat, the heaviness behind the eyes, the ache in the bones that tells you something is coming, she would make a tea from those dried flowers, strong tea. She would steep them for a long time, longer than you would think, until the water turned pale gold and the smell filled the room. She added honey and sometimes a small piece of ginger root if she had it, and she would have you drink that tea 3 times before nightfall. I cannot tell you the number of times I watched a sickness stop in its tracks after that tea. I do not mean it was cured overnight. I mean it was met. The body was given what it needed to fight, and the sickness did not take hold the way it would have if nothing had been done. My grandmother would say, "You do not wait for the flood to build the wall." She met illness at the door. She did not wait for it to settle in. The berries were different. The berries came later, in August and September, and they were never eaten raw. My grandmother was very clear about this. Raw elderberries will make you sick. They must be cooked. She simmered them slowly with water and honey until they became a thick, dark syrup, almost black, and she stored that syrup in small jars in the cellar. Through the winter, every person in the house took a spoonful each morning. Every morning, without fail. I lived in that house for the first 18 years of my life. I missed very few days of work or school to illness. None of us did. And I do not say that as a boast. I say it as a fact. The elderberry syrup was part of our daily life, the way breakfast was part of our daily life. It was not medicine in the way the outside world thinks of medicine, something you take when you are already sick. It was preparation. It was the body being told, every morning, that it had what it needed to remain strong. Now I want to tell you something about the world outside our fences, because I think it matters to what I am saying. I have seen, in the towns near us, elderberry syrup sold in small bottles for prices that would make my grandmother laugh until she cried. $15, $20 for a few ounces. The same syrup she made by the gallon from a tree growing beside her door. The same knowledge that had been free for centuries, taken and packaged and sold back to people who had forgotten they ever had it. That is not something I am angry about. I am too old for anger. But it is something I notice. The world takes what was given freely, puts it behind glass, and charges admission. and the people pay because they have forgotten they already own it. There is a lesson in that. You decide what it is, now, the third plant. And this is the one I think about the most, because this is the one connected to the story I promised you earlier. Chamomile. Chamomile grew along the walkway to my grandmother's door, like a carpet of small white and yellow flowers. It smelled sweet when you stepped on it. As a boy, I liked to crush it between my fingers and hold my hands to my face just to breathe it in. It smelled like calm. I know that sounds like a strange thing to say, that something can smell like calm, but I have no other way to describe it. When you breathe chamomile, something in your chest loosens, something in your mind slows down, and that is exactly why my grandmother grew it where she did. Chamomile was not for wounds. It was not for the winter sickness. Chamomile was for what my grandmother called the troubles of the spirit. By that, she meant worry, sleeplessness, the tightness in the stomach that comes when a person has been carrying fear too long, the restlessness of a child who cannot settle, the grief of a woman who has lost someone and cannot find her way back to the living. My grandmother made chamomile tea the way she made everything, slowly, carefully, with attention. She would pour hot water over a handful of fresh flowers, cover the cup with a cloth so the steam would not escape, and let it sit until the water was a deep golden color. Then she would hand it to whoever needed it, and she would sit with them. That was the other half of the medicine. She sat with them. I watched her do this more times than I can count. For my mother, after a stillbirth that nearly broke her. For my uncle, during a year when the crops failed and the weight of feeding his family pressed down on him until he could not sleep. For children who woke crying from dreams they could not name. My grandmother handed them chamomile, and she sat beside them, and she did not speak unless speaking was needed. Sometimes the tea was enough. Sometimes the sitting was enough. Almost always, the two together were more than enough. Now here is the story I have been carrying through this whole conversation. The one I told you about at the beginning. About 15 years ago, a family from outside our community moved to a property adjacent to our land. They were kind people. The father came over once to introduce himself, and I could see he was a man who worked hard and cared about doing right by his family. He had a young daughter, maybe 8 or 9 years old, and that girl could not sleep. Her father told me this one afternoon when we were talking across the fence. He said she had not slept through a full night in over a year. He said they had taken her to 3 different doctors. They had given her pills that made her groggy and dull during the day, but did not bring true rest at night. They had changed her diet, changed her room, changed her routine. Nothing worked. He looked exhausted. She looked exhausted. She had circles under her eyes that did not belong on a child's face. I did not say much. I am not a man who gives advice where it has not been asked for. But I went home that evening, and I picked chamomile from beside my door. I dried it carefully over 2 days, and then I brought a small cloth bag of it to the fence and handed it to her father. I told him what my grandmother would have told him. A handful of flowers in hot water, cover it. Let it steep until the water turns gold. Give it to her an hour before bed. Sit with her while she drinks it. He looked at me the way people from outside often look at us, polite, a little unsure, like I had handed him something from another century. But he was desperate enough to try. 3 days later, he came back to the fence. He did not say much either. He just stood there for a moment, and then he said, "She slept. The whole night. She slept." I do not tell you this to make chamomile sound like magic. It is not magic. It is a plant that has been used for thousands of years by people who understood that the body and the spirit are not separate things. When the spirit cannot rest, the body cannot rest, and chamomile speaks to the spirit the way a warm hand on the back of a frightened child speaks to the spirit. It does not force. It does not numb. It eases. It gives the body permission to let go. That little girl drank chamomile tea every night for months. The pills went into a drawer and stayed there, and the circles under her eyes faded the way morning fog fades when the sun is patient enough to wait. Now I must tell you the warning, because every true teaching carries a warning, the way every river carries a current beneath its surface. What I fear, what I have seen happening in the world outside our fences, is that people have lost the habit of paying attention. They have given the responsibility for their own bodies to strangers. They walk past plantain every day and do not know its name. They buy elderberry syrup from a shelf and do not know it grows on a tree that would thrive beside their own front door if they gave it half a chance. They take pills to sleep instead of sitting quietly with a cup of something that the earth offered freely. I have watched people become afraid of plants, afraid of the very things that kept their grandparents alive. I have heard them say, "But is it safe?" about chamomile, while swallowing pills with side effects that fill a page of small print they never read. That fear did not come from nowhere. It was taught. It was put into them by a world that profits when people believe they cannot take care of themselves. I am not telling you to ignore a doctor when something serious is wrong with your body. I am not a foolish man. When a bone is broken, you set it. When a wound is deep, you stitch it. There are times when the old ways step aside for the new, and wisdom is knowing when that time has come. But I am telling you this: 90% of what walked through my grandmother's door, the stings, the colds, the fevers, the sleepless nights, the anxious stomachs, the small infections, the winter aches, 90% of it was met and resolved by 3 plants that grew within arm's reach of where she sat every morning. 3 plants, that is all. Not a cabinet full of bottles with names you cannot pronounce. Not a waiting room and a bill that makes you sick in a different way. 3 plants that grow freely, that ask for almost nothing, that have been healing people since before anyone alive today was born. My grandmother did not call herself a healer. She called herself a woman who paid attention. I have spent my whole life trying to pay attention the way she did. Some days I come close. Most days I fall short. But the plants are still there beside my door. The same 3. Plantain flat against the stone, elderberry tall against the rail, chamomile scattered along the walk like small stars that fell and decided to stay. They were there the morning she died. They are there this morning as I speak to you. And if you plant them beside your own door, they will be there for your children and your grandchildren, long after you and I are both gone. That is the thing about the old knowledge. It does not expire. It does not need a refill. It does not come with a warning label. It just grows.